a formal good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this meeting and discussing the Greater Magadha thesis of Johannes Bronkhorst. It is this meeting, although it's international, it's being hosted by the University of Alberta. So I would like to thank the sponsors of this meeting, who include, of course, the University of Alberta itself, a small research funding unit that we have here on campus called CIAS, the Cool Institute for Advanced Studies. They funded the professorship that I have at this university, and they also, out of a fund that they provide, they have also supported this meeting. So thank you very much to Prem and Saroj. This university is on land that used to belong to First Nations people. So we normally make a small declaration that follows from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that published its results here in Canada 5 years ago, 5.5, 6 years ago. And so this, I will just make this statement now, which is quite normal here at this university at the beginning of any formal function. We would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples of the Treaty 6 region and the Métis settlements and Métis nations of Alberta, regions 2, 3, and 4. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our community. Well, I read Johannes Bronkhorst's book, many years ago, like many of us, and was very struck by the idea that the Greater Magadha thesis can help us to understand some features of early Indian religious and social culture that apparently we don't see very strongly, don't see at all, or don't see strongly in the corpus of Vedic literature. Although, of course, I know that some of the presenters to this seminar, to this symposium, feel that we can. So that's great. That's a controversy. That's a challenge. And since then, I've been using the Greater Magadha thesis routinely in my teaching with my undergraduate students. And I always present early classical India to them in terms of the Greater Magadha thesis and the sort of early fusion of two quite different cultures. And I also explain to the students that this is an explanatory model for certain features of ancient India that we might not otherwise be able to explain very easily. And I use the opportunity at the same time to explain to the students that that this is how historians work. You know, historians propose conjectures about how the past can be understood and how we can fit together the pieces of this enormous jigsaw, and then other people criticize them. So it's Johannes and I are devotees of the Karl Popper method of the growth of knowledge. So through this process of conjectures and refutations, we hope that ideas get refined and made more precise. And while there was a spate of very clear, good reviewing of Johannes's book after it came out in 2007, indeed much of it by the participants of this symposium, since then I've had this feeling that the the debate had kind of gone quiet, but there was still a lot of question marks in many people's minds. So, for example, I've seen many books that just take the Greater Magadha theory as, you know, as the standard theory of early Indian culture and just use it and move on. And others that raise a question mark, and others that say this has been proposed, but I don't agree with it. So various different points of view exist on this conjecture. And while I use it with my students, both as a as an explanation of early India, but also as a lesson in historiography, in how historians work, that we're not saying this is the truth. What we're saying is this is a strong and plausible explanation of the events we see, the data that is in front of us. I always do that, which is actually a very useful exercise for the students, because usually they come into the classes wanting to know the facts. So, you know, we have to move away from the von Rankian mode of history. So it's very useful, but I still felt that it would be helpful to have a debate and a discussion amongst those people who've engaged, as far as I know, in my very limited knowledge, most strongly with this theory. And that is why I reached out to all of those of you here today in this symposium. 18 months ago, I thought that it would be helpful to have a small local meeting here at the University of Alberta, and get us all in a room together, if possible with Johannes. And Johannes very generously agreed to make the long journey from Switzerland to Western Canada. And we would all just be together and have a chance. And I thought we'd have rather small talks, but quite a lot of coffee breaks. do it that way. And of course, the pandemic shattered all of that. And as time has passed, my hopes for holding this meeting locally as a physical meeting have just faded and faded. And at some point I had to make a decision. Are we just going to go online, or are we going to hope that sometime soon international travel will open up again? So we obviously, here we are online. And this, what I didn't foresee is that this to some extent changes the nature of the meeting. And this is just, you know, me finding my way as things evolve. So it's a bit different for all of us. We don't feel that we're completely in touch with each other as we would if we were all in the same room. But I still hope that it will be possible for us to have conversations, short conversations and exchanges at the end of each session, and then perhaps a longer conversation just before we close down at the end of each day. So I want to encourage all of you as panelists, as participants in this symposium, to make notes, to ask questions, to pose challenges as we move through our talks. Of course, the other element for all of us as panelists is that this is now a public occasion. We're being witnessed by many kind people who have shown interest in this meeting, so that as panelists we don't see all of the people who are listening, but we know that they are there, so we are also speaking to a wider public. I think that's all I have to say at the moment. In terms of administration, we made a last-minute decision yesterday to use the Slido software for the attendees, for the general public who are listening to us, to be able to pose questions. So, and on the main website of the conference, there's a link to that. So don't use the Q&A and the chat at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Go to that other service for questions and answers. I understand it means you have to have two windows open on your screen, but I'm told, I've never used it myself, but I'm told that the Slido service is significantly more convenient, easier to use, and clearer than the Zoom system, and also that you can vote questions up and down. So you can, if you think a question is a really good one, you can vote on it and it will rise to the surface, as it were. And I'm very grateful to Patricia Sarthoff, who's here in the meeting, who very kindly agreed at short notice to help handle the Q&A aspect of this. And the questions and answers, I expect us to interact with them during that last hour of each day's session. Rather than, I don't think we can split our attention and try and handle them as we go along, but maybe we'll feel our way forward on that. All right, so now let me just look at the time. It's approaching 1/4 past the hour. And I think for myself, I have said everything. I would like to just warmly welcome you all panelists here and say also a welcome to all of those of you who are listening to this session, and thank you for your interest. I think as a matter of policy, I would like to keep to our published timetable. So now, for example, there's a 15-minute break between now and when Johannes will speak. So I don't want to start you off yet, Johannes. I think because of the large number of outside people who are interested, we should all start our talks at the time that it's advertised. So when there's a break, as there is a little bit now, we'll just maybe switch off our cameras and have a few minutes pause. May I ask the panelists if they have any remarks or questions or anything that they would like to say? Is there anything you think I should have said? Then in that case, I think we're all good. And just for the benefit of those who are listening, I need language for this. Zoom calls the general public participants, so I'm going to call them participants. I think Eventleaf calls the public attendees, but let's just talk about participants. I just wanted to say that one of the symposium members, Vagish Narasimham, will be joining the proceedings as he can, and he will be giving his talk as scheduled. It's just that he's just in a very busy teaching time at the moment at his university, and his classes clash with the time that we chose for this webinar. So he has to, right now he's in front of a class of adoring students. So he has to do his teaching and attend the symposium as he can. So that if you had logged in to see Vagish and wondered why he wasn't here, that's the reason. All right, well, thank you everybody. And we will now just have a short pause before we start our first session in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Well, good morning again, and hello, Johannes. I would like to invoke at the beginning our long friendship, Johannes, and just to say that I think we met in about 1978, first of all, during our days in Pune. You were working mostly at Deccan College, if I remember rightly, but also with a number of pundits, and I was a bit more involved up at the university campus. But we had many good conversations and happy meetings, and I remember those days as good and special days. In a preliminary conversation a few days ago, Johannes reminded me that the work he did that was published in the Great Magadha book was done about 17 years ago, which means that the Great Magadha book, which was published in 2007, is now a teenager and therefore has left home and is behaving badly. And also that maybe the parents cannot be held entirely responsible for the behavior of the children. But the book is a major statement, and Johannes pushed it out into the world already, in 2007, and the book itself is based on ideas and thoughts that Johannes had been having for a long time. I mean, right back to early publications in the early 1980s, I think. If not, I mean, you can make this more precise if you wish, Johannes. But it was like a fresh synthesis of new ideas and materials that you'd been publishing and thinking about for a very long time as well. And of course, it is also part of a larger argument in a way, which is adumbrated in the book itself, but which you worked out in the two subsequent books, Buddhism in the Shadow of Brahmanism and How the Brahmins Won. So in a meeting like this, which is being held so many years after you published that material, you yourself may have also changed your mind about some points, and if you have, that will be very interesting to learn about. And you also will have a more distanced view of the work that you did already over 10 years ago. Then it just remains for me to, I should have done this at the beginning, but to say that it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Université de Lausanne, and to invite you, Johannes, to open our symposium with your remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominik. You hear me, right? Okay,
I do.
Thank you, Dominik, and thank you for this introduction. Thank you also for organizing this meeting, which I look forward to, which I enjoy already. And I think it's very nice to be able to rechew the cut of something which I wrote a number of years ago and which has occupied me for a long time. You also recall that we have known each other for a long time, and we have had occasions to discuss things, and that is of some relevance also for in the present context, that what you said in the introduction, we both share something, broadly speaking, we could call a Popperian approach to theories. I use the word theory following you, Dominik. You call this the Greater Magadha theory, that's what I will call it. What we share is the belief that theories can never be proved right. Sometimes they can be proved wrong. More in practice, more often we have to compare theories and choose the better one by finding the weak spots, the weak aspects of theories. And so I suppose that I hope that in this meeting, that's what it will all be about. We compare theories, and one of them being the Greater Magadha theory, and necessarily the other one, or there can be other ones, but the one that comes to mind primarily is the more traditional point of view that probably all of us started with in our academic careers, and about which I will say a word or two. I will use this occasion to briefly recall some of the main points of my book, Greater Magadha, but I will first try to rectify something, Dom, you will excuse me. You announced this conference by saying what the theory of Greater Magadha was all about. And it's on the site, we have all read it. It's about two waves of immigration. Now, the point is, nowhere in the book do I support that position. And once I read your announcements, I went carefully through the whole book, and I mentioned this only on one occasion in a passage, which I will not quote in full, but which ends by saying investigations among these lines of different waves that entered India at different times, are beyond the scope of this book. So even though I find that a very interesting idea, and I hope that other speakers will elucidate me and others about various waves, because it would clarify many points in my book, it is not a point about which I have pronounced. Partly because I feel incompetent, or I felt incompetent to pronounce on it, partly also because I'm convinced that the weakest part of any chain is the weakest link. And to enter into a discussion about a speculative theory about how the Indo-Aryans came into India might weaken the theory as a whole. So I really wanted to avoid it in that book. At this point, of course, I'll be delighted if people address the issue and come up with suggestions or even more. Okay, so that is what the greater Magadha theory is not primarily about. And now I'm going to say a few things about what it is about. And rather than, instead of giving a resume of the book, I propose to briefly describe the difficulties that I experienced when, as a student, I was confronted with the traditional point of view. Part of this traditional point of view was that the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution was developed in Vedic circles and found its first expression in some of the early Upanishads. The same theory of rebirth and karmic retribution, or something close to it, underlay the new religions of Buddhism and Jainism. The traditional conclusion was drawn that these Upanishads, primarily the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya Upanishad, preceded the beginning of Buddhism and Jainism. Now, in principle, all this sounded plausible enough. However, I felt uncomfortable about a few points. To begin with, the Upanishadic messages concerned those Upanishadic passages present some esoteric speculations about people's fate after death. In contrast, Buddhism and Jainism look upon this same belief not as esoteric speculation or as a philosophical possibility, and certainly not as a secret doctrine, but as a generally accepted certainty. So much so that some people were ready to take extreme steps to avoid its main consequence, namely rebirth. By doing so, they responded not to a remote philosophical possibility, but to a certainty that was shared not only by some few thinkers, but, as it seems, by everyone in the society in which they lived. And those who responded by giving up all their possessions and leave all that was dear to them were not even people closely involved with the Vedic tradition, but people who apparently had very little, if anything, to do with it. Theoretically, it is of course possible for ideas to spread and for an esoteric belief shared by few to become the standard conviction of whole populations. But this, from the traditional point of view, must have happened in a very short time. It was difficult to date the early Upanishads earlier than the 6th century before the Common Era, and the beginning of Buddhism was certainly to be dated in the 5th century before the Common Era at the latest. Jainism, in the form preached by Parshva, was even older than Buddhism, even though we do not know by how much. This left precious little time for an esoteric belief to become a conviction held by all. This worried me. I talk about my reflections as a student. I felt some relief when I came across the idea that other actors might have been involved in this development. The Shramanas. I read about them first in a book by G.C. Pandey, Studies in the Origin of Buddhism. I had known G.C. Pandey in Jaipur as a student when I was far too young and ignorant to form an opinion about his work. But the ideas of the Shramanas appealed to me. However, it did not answer a number of questions. Shramanas were wandering ascetics who, it was claimed, developed certain revolutionary ideas. This, as it seemed to me, put the cart before the horse. Wandering ascetics become wandering ascetics because of the beliefs they had before they became wandering ascetics. They did not, therefore, develop these beliefs after they had become wandering ascetics. It seemed to me most natural to assume that those who were to become wandering ascetics received fundamental ideas and beliefs, such as the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution, from their parents and others in their immediate surroundings. These ideas and beliefs then induced them to give up all they had and adopt an ascetic lifestyle. In other words, the existence of these shramanas could not explain these new ideas. Their existence rather indicated that those ideas were held in certain sections of society or in certain regions. With these thoughts in mind, I looked at the evidence supporting the traditional position. The first question that came up was that of chronology. How certain is it that the early Upanishads, and most in particular the passages that introduce rebirth and karmic retribution, precede the beginnings of Buddhism and Jainism? Much to my surprise, I discovered that the main argument for their antiquity was circular, as follows. The doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution finds its first expression in the early Upanishads because these Upanishads are older than other manifestations of this belief, like Buddhism and Jainism. Then, these Upanishads are older because they contain the first expressions of this doctrine. The reason is obviously circular and therefore proves nothing whatsoever. Another common argument for the antiquity of all Vedic texts, including the early Upanishads, relied on the grammarian Panini. Panini, it was argued, described classical Sanskrit. The Vedic texts use an earlier form of Sanskrit. Ergo, all Vedic texts are older than Panini. This was the common reasoning, which we still find here and there. The problem with this argument is that the language described by Panini is closest to the one used in certain Brahmana texts. The Aitareya Brahmana has sometimes been mentioned as staying closest to Panini. Panini is nowadays dated in the second half of the 4th century before the Common Era, half a century or so after the death of the Buddha. It would be tempting to conclude from this that the early Upanishads could be older than Panini and therefore a lot more recent than the beginnings of Buddhism and Jainism. At this point, I wish to say a few words about the attempts sometimes made to derive the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution from ideas found in presumably earlier Vedic texts. Developments of ideas are proposed that supposedly culminate in that doctrine. Let me first admit that I am rather suspicious with regard to such attempts. As a young student, I was confronted with the view that the Nirukta and other early Indian texts, a text on etymologizing, had to be older than Panini's grammar because the content of the Nirukta was so much more primitive than the content of Panini's grammar. Hermann Oldenberg made exactly the same argument with respect to the early Upanishads and early Buddhist literature. He said, the former must be older because they are so much more primitive. Well, as far as Panini and the Nirukta are concerned, I have meanwhile come to think that there are good reasons to think that the latter, that's the Nirukta, is actually younger, more recent than Panini's grammar. Indeed, arguments based on reconstructed developments of thought have to be treated with the utmost caution. However, let us assume, for argument's sake, that a developmental sequence of Vedic ideas can be proposed that culminates in the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution. Suppose further that the chronological order of the passages that contain these ideas has been confirmed on independent grounds, not to suit the argument of the person, but independently we can determine the sequence, chronological sequence of certain texts, and we say in these texts we find certain ideas that develop and culminate in the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution. Well, such a proposed sequence might feel illuminating to those who are already convinced that a doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution has Vedic roots. To others, it proves next to nothing. It might merely show, if anything, how the Vedic tradition adjusted to and ultimately absorbed the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution held by people outside the Vedic tradition. It might then merely illustrate how such outside beliefs gradually came to influence the authors of the Vedic text concerned. As far as I can see, any so-called developmental sequence can be interpreted either way and cannot be used to prove anything. Now, I like to illustrate this, and instead of remaining abstractly talking about texts that we cannot date with ideas that we barely understand, I will give an example, a very recent example from a totally different domain about the Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume is, of course, normally studied in the context of the history of Western philosophy. He himself admits his indebtedness to earlier thinkers, and he mentions a number of them, including Descartes and others. And yet, recent research suggests that his remarkable claim that there is no soul, no self, may surprisingly, and hold on tight, may surprisingly have been made under the influence of Buddhist thought. It turns out that Hume spent 2 years in a town in France, La Flèche, where also 2 Jesuit missionaries spent time who had an intimate knowledge of Buddhism. One of them had passed 5 years in a monastery in Tibet, the other one 2 years in a monastery in Siam in Thailand. Hume may even have met one of them. Now, Hume is and has always been studied in the context of the history of Western philosophy, and rightly so. But does that mean that the theory of Buddhist influence has to be rejected for that reason? Should we say, no, we should only study his orthodox sources within Western philosophical tradition, and such an outside influence we must discard because, well, it is not part of the Western tradition? Of course not. The theory must be judged on its own merits, that is, on the evidence available. And there can be no a priori claim that Hume must only be studied in his Western context so that he cannot have undergone Buddhist influence. Now, similarly, back to India, the claim that the theory of rebirth and karmic retribution as we find it in the early Upanishads can and must exclusively be studied in the light of other Vedic texts has no leg to stand on. Note that I speak of rebirth and karmic retribution. Belief in rebirth without karmic retribution is widespread and occurs in many societies all over the world. The combination rebirth and karmic retribution, on the other hand, is very rare and may have been invented only twice, in ancient India and in ancient Greece. The fact that the notion of rebirth can be found in earlier Vedic texts, as has been maintained, should not therefore surprise us and does not explain how the notion of rebirth with karmic retribution came about. I'll have to say a few more words about that later. But for the time being, I conclude this part about chronology. I think we can conclude that the least one can say is that traditional chronology needs a thorough rethink. And the claim that the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution must be derived from Vedic thought cannot be based on chronological considerations. And without a fitting chronology, there is little left to support that claim. Okay, I continue my story about my, let's call it, intellectual development. Having come this far in my thinking, I was struck by the fact that the most prominent early movements that based themselves on the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution, Buddhism and Jainism, had arisen in the eastern parts of northern India, in what I call Greater Magadha. Since I was looking for a society, and therefore preferably a region where this belief was held, and not for some isolated philosophical ideas, it seemed plausible to think that this was that region. Certain disparaging remarks in Vedic texts with respect to that region made this assumption all the more plausible. Well, of course, one can say, okay, we accept that there was a cultural divide in northern India, but did it have to be a regional divide? Was it a geographical? Was there a geographical distinction between two different cultures? One could equally imagine that in one and the same region, different groups held different beliefs. And for example, one could think of what is sometimes called the Veda belt, the region more to the west in North India, where many of the Vedic texts were composed. One could think that, yes, the authors of those texts, they had their kinds of ideas, but the rest of society, or a large part of it, did not share these ideas at all and believed in rebirth and karmic retribution. And if that were the case, we would not so much have to postulate that this belief was regional, as I have done in my book. Personally, I find it a little bit difficult to imagine that most or many of the inhabitants of that so-called Veda belt held beliefs altogether different from those of the Vedic Brahmins who composed their Vedic texts there. I admit that this is not impossible, but I find it implausible. There is a case that is a little bit more challenging, that is that of Vedic schools that settled in Greater Magadha, that is outside the Veda belt, in non-Vedic territory. Parts of the Shatapatha Brahmana, in its Kanva version, appear to have been composed in Kosala and Videha. That's the names of a region that overlaps with Greater Magadha. Is it possible, as one might claim, that the culture of the Shatapatha Brahmana, or of its relevant parts and recensions, constituted the cultural milieu in which the Buddha and the Jina grew up? The idea is interesting. However, we should not forget that Brahmins that have recently arrived in a region do not necessarily determine its culture. The Buddhist texts suggest that there were Brahmins in the areas visited by the Buddha, but there are reasons to think that they were relative newcomers. Greater Magadha was not part of the Veda belt. That means that the generally shared beliefs of the population may have been quite different from those held by the newly arriving Brahmins. If, on the other hand, study reveals that there are similarities between the Vedic texts composed in that region and the beliefs which we associate with Greater Magadha, it is in my view, most plausible to assume that those Vedic texts absorbed features from their surroundings, but not without adapting them to their own tradition. I like to clarify one point that has sometimes come up in all these discussions. The cultural divide I talk about is not between those who do and those who do not practice asceticism. This, as I see it, is a confusion that owes much of its popularity to the writings of the French sociologist Louis Dumont. Dumont distinguished between renouncers and people in the world. For him, all ascetics of ancient India fall under the category renouncer. I think that this position does great injustice to the sources. They don't put all people who leave the world into one category. These sources distinguish between those who became ascetics because they believed in rebirth and karmic retribution, and others who do so for altogether different reasons. The first category of ascetics, those who have become ascetic because they believe in rebirth and karmic retribution, they strive after liberation, which means liberation from the cycle of rebirths. The second category has, as we find it in the texts, has strong associations with the Vedic sacrificial tradition. These ascetics typically do not strive after liberation, but after heaven. Dumont and his followers ignore this distinction and rather emphasize the distinction between people who opt in and those who opt out of society. Ascetics were those who opted out. The beliefs of those ascetics were not considered. I feel that such ideas needlessly create confusion. So, to be clear, there are, even in the realm of ascetics, there are two kinds. There are those who seek an escape, liberation from rebirth and karmic retribution, and for that reason are convinced of rebirth and karmic retribution, and there are others who don't share that belief and whose ideas are rather linked to Vedic traditions of sacrifice. Well, I do hope, of course, that some of the participants in this conference will provide supporting evidence for the geographical divide that I propose in my book. And this is where the different waves of immigration, immigrating Indo-European speakers come back in. If archaeological or genetic research confirms that there were indeed two or more such waves, the idea of cultural differences between East and West gains in plausibility. And if linguistic analysis brings to light important differences between East and West, the idea of a cultural geographical divide gains strength. My hopes go further than this. I hope that the greater Magadha theory may give rise to further questions and, who knows, solutions. One question seems particularly pertinent. If the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution did not derive from Vedic antecedents, where then did it come from? One answer has been suggested in a recent publication, and that is an answer that appeals to me. It claims that one of the contributing factors that gave rise to the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution is monetization and the introduction of coinage in particular. I have not yet had time to think this through, but have the feeling that this could be an idea worth pursuing. The publication concerned It's called The Origins of Philosophy in Ancient Greece and Ancient India, and it's written by Richard Seaford. This publication emphasizes that there is a spatial correlation between the metaphysical transformation that included the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution and the earliest coinage. So this belief, rebirth and karmic retribution, and earliest coinage seem to overlap in a certain way. To quote from the book, they both occurred in the Gangetic area, not least in Greater Magadha. Obviously, Seaford had read the book Greater Magadha. The same book then states elsewhere, there is nothing in all the evidence presented by Bronkhorst and others that is inconsistent with the view that by far the most important factor behind the new metaphysics was urbanization with its consequences, inasmuch as Greater Magadha contained more not only of the earliest cities, but also, crucially, of the earliest coins than did Kuru Panchala. Kuru Panchala is the Veda belt to the west. It would be entirely in accord with my perspective, that means Seaford's perspective, that it contributed much to the new metaphysical currents. Let me be clear, not to create false impressions, that Seaford's book includes more in these metaphysical currents than only the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution. But this, rebirth and karmic retribution, is the only belief I am at present interested in. The book refers to this belief as EIR, ethicized indiscriminate reincarnation, and then says that this EIR, ethicized indiscriminate reincarnation, is, as a communal belief, found only in beliefs held or originating in ancient India and ancient Greece. Moreover, the book says elsewhere, no other pre-monetary peoples that we know of have ever devised these beliefs. And it's then observed finally, it would be a remarkable coincidence if these beliefs happen to have been devised by precisely the two people who were to be the first monetized people in history. As I said already, I like this idea, even though I don't see as yet clearly what precise arguments could support it. However that may be, this hypothesis can be read, I think, as an interesting, but for the moment speculative, extension of the Greater Magadha theory. I have only talked so far about rebirth and karmic retribution. Of course, those who have read my book know that these are not the only features I ascribe to the culture of Greater Magadha. There are quite a number of others that people had been aware of. Well, let me mention this briefly. In Indian medicine, there are, as Zisk pointed out, there are two currents. And he called one of those magico-religious, that means trying to cure people using sorcery, spells, and amulets. And the other he called empirical rational. It's based basically on a theoretical conception of how the body works and how it can be cured. Now, this distinction introduced by Zisk makes sense in the context of the Greater Magadha theory. It also makes sense of the fact that the founder of the so-called orthodox Sankhya philosophy, Kapila, is in some early texts characterized as a demon, or somehow related to demons. Because the Sankhya philosophy is particularly close to the ideas that were presumably current in Greater Magadha. And then there is the sudden appearance in the Brahmanical tradition of cycles of time, of which there is no trace in Vedic literature, and which were clearly part of Buddhism and Jainism from the very beginning. There are a number of features like these which are presented in the book, The Greater Magadha, which I will not elaborate further at this point, because most of the crucial evidence, the strongest arguments, derive from a close consideration of the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution. Okay, let me sum up. The Greater Magadha theory can be criticized or improved. I hope that this conference will be an occasion for both criticism and suggestions for improvements. I will be particularly delighted if the theory can be taken as point of departure for further developments, new inquiries, further research, and in the end, deeper insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I have taken the opportunity to rewrite the past by removing the references to multiple waves from the front page of the conference. Yes, so the floor is open for conversation. Would anybody like to raise questions? Maybe I can just start things off. I have not read Seifert's book. What argument does he make about the causal relationship between monetization and the development of rebirth? Especially, I mean, karmic retribution, I can understand the idea that people may now have a clearer idea of the concept of debt. But how does monetization cause one to think about rebirth? Is it the idea of bankruptcy?
Well, actually, I discovered his book only recently, and I've gone through it only superficially, and I'm left more or less the same questions perhaps as you. And I think this needs much closer study before one can come to final decisions. And so don't interrogate me on his book. I'm afraid
No. There is something that came to mind. It's probably come to the mind of others before me too, but is that I've always been puzzled by an expression right at the end of the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, where the author uses the expression akusi dasya, meaning, you know, not having a debt. Other people, especially Philip, who is present here today, have thought much more deeply about these issues than I have. But for me, at least, that seems to be like a monetary term that suddenly pops into a work on yoga, foundational work on yoga, without any obvious explanation, to me anyway. Are there anybody else would like to ask questions?
May I just a few words?
Of course. Don't ask.
About Seifert's book. Yes, I read this book some time ago, so I don't remember it very well. But generally, his idea is he doesn't write much about rebirth. He writes more about rational thought, which is this kind of rational thought connected with calculus and so on. And his first book was on influence of monetization on ancient Greece, and then he decided to write a book which compares both traditions, and he's made as even now I have checked, there is not even the word rebirth in his index. So and generally he thinks, and this is, I like this idea generally, that the concept of money is very abstract and completely, and allows us to understand the world in a different way, in a much more rational way, much more in the way that, you know, you pay, you lose, and so on. So it is really worth reading, although he doesn't know well. We should remember that he's not Sanskritist, so he looks at the text, Indian text, from the secondary sources. But as far as for Greece, I am not classic, so I liked very much his book on Greece, and you know, with Indian sources, it's a bit different because I know the text. But this is just to add about Seaford.
Yes, perhaps I should say that I like the idea of linking rebirth and karmic retribution with monetization, but I could not mention that without mentioning Seaford. But I don't want to be his advocate, because there's much in his book where I have doubts or uncertainty, and in no way do I want to simply say stand behind everything he says. But I didn't
mind it, of course. I didn't mind it. It was not my intention to put you into the shoes of his advocate. Just wanted to add a little bit about his book generally.
Yes, Alex, I think you.
Surely the dating is completely out for coins. As far as I'm aware, the earliest punched mark coins from the Gangetic Plains, they go back to the mid 4th century BC, no earlier. This is roughly the period of the Second Council of Vesali, where they play a big role in the disputes in the Buddhist order there. But in the rest of the Pali Suttas, Kahapanas are marginal. One of the vows of a Buddhist bhikkhu is to abstain from, gold and silver. So that is not a term for coinage. So I don't think the dates would fit for this.
Well, I don't want to particularly answer your question. I just wanted to throw in an idea to be explored. You may be right in what you say or not, but I personally feel that if someone would look into it a bit more closely, it might bring something or not. It's hardly central to what I want to convey.
Can I ask a question? After the publication of your book, Johannes, I frequently encountered the idea that the theory of karma and rebirth most naturally would have arisen in the context of the Black Yajurveda. I personally have not been convinced by this idea, besides seeing that Yajurveda may be a kind of candidate for this theory because it's involved with action in a general sense. But I have never been able to find out what the connection to rebirth and karma should actually be. Can you say something about this idea? Have you also seen this in secondary literature as an alternative to your idea? And what do you think about this?
Well, frankly, I think one of the best representatives of that position is among us. And I hope she will now or later use the time to explain this. And obviously, I will not try to do it for her.
Maybe I can just make a correction. If you're regarding my work, I look at the Shukla Yajurveda, not the Krishna Yajurveda. It's an important distinction, partly because of the regional distinction that Johannes had mentioned earlier, that the Krishna Yajurveda is more in the Kuru Panchala realm, and the Yajurveda that's Shukla, so white Yajurveda, at least the Yajnavalkya parts are considered to have their origins in this Kosala Vaideha region. So I think just in terms of the location, it makes them a very interesting candidate for study. And they do have a lot of particular content, I believe, that is in line with a lot of ideas we see in early Buddhism, but it's not completely divorced from the rest of Vedic tradition. My current work now is to look at kind of Vedic philosophy in general, whereas my dissertation was focused more on the Kanva Shatapatha Brahmana. So I'm trying to tease out now kind of, well, what is kind of the general Vedic view on some of these issues? I'm looking at language and causality in particular. But there are some interesting distinctions as well. So I will keep that, but I've already worked on that in my dissertation. But I think what Johannes had said earlier is quite interesting. I mean, when looking at these Vedic texts, I just like to say that we have a lot of work yet to do to understand the texts that we do have. And we've lost a lot of Vedic texts. We have records of Brahmanas that we no longer have, a copy of. So it's very difficult to say, like, with any accuracy, well, what did this Vedic tradition expound in ancient times? Because we've just lost so much of the record. And we don't have much record either for the traditions of Greater Magadha. So we're using kind of the remnants, you could say, but it's a fragment of what would have been present back then. So we have some blind spots. And I'd like to also raise a question that I got from the work of Hank Bodovitz. He has a book on the Vedic, what did he call it? Well, anyway, it's his 2019 publication. And he asks this very important question. Okay, we know that there is some acculturation, but how do we account for acculturation? Like, how do you define it? How would you track it? How would you measure it? And this is a very interesting question. Obviously, you have people coming in contact with each other, but then now, so many years after, how do we account for this? Where do we draw the lines? And I think that we have some good starting points from Johannes's work, but there's still more work to be done on this question.
Clearly, yes, thank you.
Philip, did you want to say more about your observations on the Krishna Yajurveda?
No, I clearly see that in principle, I mean, we have a whole conference before us, and it's not the right occasion now to go into controversy and to try to deal with different perspectives right at the beginning. Okay. So it was maybe a too early shot, I have to admit.
Well, I hope that we'll circle around to it in the coming days. Are there any other points to be raised at this point, or responses? Johannes, I'd like as well to say again, this is when you said monetization, and you referred to Seifert's book, just before you introduced the book, I can't remember, somewhere there you talked about urbanization, and urbanization I would have thought was a more interesting or more obvious, not interesting, a more obvious candidate as a major event. You know, there are many questions about the second urbanization of North India, but it's a big deal. It happens, it's there, and the Buddha knows about cities. He criticizes city life and contrasts his ideal life with that of, you know, the sort of corrupt life of the city. Evidently, urbanization has an impact. Again, I can't, you know, I can't translate that into the rise of the linked doctrines of karma and rebirth. But if one were going to talk about anything, that one would jump into my mind first of all, before monetization, I think.
Yes, you may be right. And in fact, urbanization is no doubt an important factor. And the interesting thing is that the Brahmanical Orthodox tradition, more, I think, than the Buddhist or Jaina tradition, was so much against cities. They advocated a pure life outside cities if they mentioned them at all, but more often in their texts they simply ignore them. They live in a world of their own, and they let this whole development of urbanization take place besides them. So that's another reason why the urban context seems the place where such new ideas can originate, flourish, without the Brahmanical tradition initially being much influenced at all. They go on following their old ways, denying the new developments, saying that somehow doing as if they don't exist. So I fully agree with you. Once again, how then, if there is anything specifiable in such a development, can we say why urban developments should give rise to that? And is that something that can be generalized? Is it true in all cultures or so? These are lots of questions that come up and that are not easy to answer. But in principle, I'm completely on your side. Yeah.
Actually, rather, I hadn't thought of it in this framework until right now, but a very striking example of the, shall we say, the resistance or the independence of the Vedic tradition to urbanization is the fact that I have personally attended 2 or 3 Vedic sacrifices involving fire that took place indoors, that actually people built the hearth and lit the fire and conducted everything inside a room in an upstairs flat in somebody's house. And it seemed so incongruous and so strange, a real tension between events that should be au plein air and something that happens inside a built environment.
Yes, it's one of the points I've tried to emphasize in some of my other publications, that the denial of developments that take place. For example, well, we know that early Vedic texts were orally recited. I don't want to contest that, but they still went on refusing to mention writing in texts that were obviously written down. And so they went on living in this alternative reality in which there was no writing, there were no cities, and a number of other things. They went on maintaining an illusion, we would say. Yeah.
There's that famous passage in one of the shikshas that the worst way to recite the Veda is Likitapartaka, and also Shirahkampi.
Yeah. So from that point of, I've once made a comparison, and I was being chided for that, but yet I found it so illuminating that in the Third Reich in Germany, there was a major art exhibition that Hitler himself opened, and there were many landscapes and so on, but among the hundreds of paintings, there was not one that showed city life. In the country, that had more cities than the rest of Europe combined, that was highly urbanized. That was, again, a totally different tradition, but nonetheless one that didn't want to absorb the modern developments. And in spite of all the major differences, I find that a bit elucidating when we think of Brahmanism in these early days. There were things happening and they didn't want to know about them, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to look far beyond the present day to find subsections of society that project an idealistic world and reject the apparent reality around them.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you very much, Johannes, for your wonderful introduction. It really sets the scene brilliantly for us. We have just a few minutes. I suggest that we reconvene in 3 or 4 minutes for Tim's talk. So thank you very much, and I'll see you all in just a few moments. I'm just waiting for Tim to turn on his camera.
Sorry.
Ah, there you are. Hello.
Hello.
So it's my pleasure to introduce now Tim Lubin, who is the professor of religion and adjunct professor of law at W&L University, Washington and Lee University, who will now speak to us about Brahmins, Ascetics, and the constitution of caste in Greater Magadha. Tim.
So can you allow me to share my screen?
Does that work?
I think so, yes.
Yes,
Also,
yes.
I have made available a handout summarizing some of the main points I'm going to make, since they're a little complicated, and that is in the Slido message area. So let me just maximize this. Can you all see this screen now?
Yes, at least I can. I think everyone can. In fact, yes, I can confirm that ordinary participants, ordinary attendees can also see it.
Very good, very good. So I feel very honored to be invited to join Johannes on this virtual stage to talk about some of the importance of Magadha in Indian history. I was originally drawn to his work because he was addressing some of the same questions that I was struggling with, and in doing so, and was doing so from a range of surprising angles. My remarks are going to stick to the main areas of overlap between his work and my work, but in subsequent discussions this weekend, we may have a chance to address a wider range of his arguments. So, let me make sure I can navigate here. There we go. The story of India's earliest religious history has often been told as a family drama or a religious schism. The priests of the Veda were challenged by upstart ascetic dissenters, Protestants, so to speak, who had grown disillusioned by their own old ways and went in quest of deeper truths by turning inward and ethicizing ritual concerns. By that account, the law of karma, a natural law, but one with moral implications, was said to have orthogenetically developed out of the older Vedic ritual-focused dogma. One of the reasons scholars adopted that narrative is that it accorded well with the accounts transmitted within the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions themselves. On the Hindu side, a mystical ascetical path was depicted in the Upanishads as a higher order explanation of the mysteries of the fire sacrifice, and by extension of the universe, and by extension of the individual self, to which the certain sages like Yajnavalkya turned their attention. Meanwhile, the Buddha and Mahavira were represented in the scriptures of those traditions as rejecting the Vedic religion, critiquing and redefining its key elements, and sometimes as debating with and actually converting Brahmin ritualists. Johannes has offered several objections to the standard account, which he's just recapitulated for us. So I'm not sure that I need to recapitulate them again, recapitulate, but I'll just hit a few of the points that I'm going to respond to. First, that the early Vedic texts show no trace of a concept of cyclical rebirth or of a law of karma, an interconnected pair of ideas that are shared by all the other religions that have their origins in India. The early Veda instead posits an afterlife in the world of the ancestors or in heaven, earned by fulfilling ritual obligations in a single lifetime. In later Hinduism, these two conceptions of afterlife persist anomalously side by side, a paradox that sometimes goes unacknowledged and is sometimes otherwise explained away one way or another. Building on the stages of formation of the Vedic literature identified by Michael Witzel, he noted how the internal chronology and geographical references in the surviving Vedic literature reveal a spatial progression from the Punjab in the northwest to the north-central Kuru Panchala region, and then further eastwards down the Ganges-Jamna Valley before expanding in the south. Like Witzel, he points to the Shatapara Brahmana's story of how Agni, the divine ritual fire, accompanied by King Videgha Madhava and his priest, burned eastward, making the lands fit for the Brahmin way of life. The first Sanskrit sources to adumbrate a notion of rebirth determined by one's deeds are Upanishads, whose geographic focus is the Eastern Ganges Valley, as has already been mentioned. And he notes, as others have, that many of the secret doctrines presented as ideas are presented in those texts as ideas that, quote, had never reached the Brahmins, unquote, and are attributed to kings who, contrary to the normal order in Brahmanical sources, teach them to the Brahmins. Bronkhorst takes pains to argue that even the early Upanishads were composed or anyway completed after the time of the Buddha, and that many other parts of the Veda were composed or anyway updated during or after the Maurya period. Indeed, no Vedic source appears immune to revisionist dating, even the venerable Rig Veda. Meanwhile, the Buddha is understood to have lived and preached in Kosala, Videha, and Magadha, the same country, basically in the same region as these Upanishads. So these are the key points that I took away from his books. The eastern limit of Vedic culture was the confluence of the Ganges and Jamna rivers. Beyond it lay what lay Magadha and other regions that Johannes has grouped together as Greater Magadha, modern day Bihar, more or less, which in the older Vedic sources was depicted as a land beyond the pale, uncivilized and full of disreputable sorts of people like that fellow from Magadha, the Magadha, who is made to exchange licentious banter with a prostitute during the course of the Mahavrata ritual, which Stephanie Jamison calls a three-ring circus on the penultimate day of the Vedic Gavamayana Satra sacrifice. Yet this supposedly uncouth land turned out to be the center of India's first historical empire. Oh, by the way, I should be showing you this slide with the geography of these regions. So now the Brahmins and Agni have arrived down here. This supposedly uncouth region turns out to be the one that was the center of this first historical empire, that of the Mauryas, founded around 320 BCE. Already a couple of centuries after the region became the heart of India's second urbanization. I am going to be saying a bit more about this issue of urbanization that was just raised in the comments. The first, of course, in the Indus Valley, we know only from archaeological remains, so it's very hard to make a comparison now. Bronkhorst concluded that it was no mere coincidence that the rise of Magadha witnessed the appearance in the historical record of fundamentally different cosmological, religious, and ethical ideas, that they were manifestations of a distinct regional culture, and that changes that appeared in the late Vedic and post-Vedic Brahmanistic sources were the result of a confrontation with and competition with that new alien culture, alien, that is, to the earlier Vedic tradition. He inferred from this that Brahmins did not occupy a dominant position in the area in which the Buddha preached his message, and that this message was not, therefore, a reaction against Brahmanical thought and culture. That's actually his expression from the second of his books. Instead, the Buddha and the other world renouncers represented a wholly separate cultural tradition, which only secondarily came to be reframed in the scriptures as we have them as a critique of Brahmins and their rituals, as the latter became more prominent in that region. So should we accept this account? It does appear to have been the case that Vedic culture spread from Gandhara down the Ganges Valley, that regions east of the confluence of the Ganges and the Jamna were initially viewed as impure and un-Vedic, that karma and rebirth appear in late Vedic Sanskrit sources in a way that makes them look novel and unprecedented, and that first appears in sources composed in and around Greater Magadha. The earliest Buddhist scriptures that have been preserved are centuries later than the Buddha himself, nowadays thought to have lived around 400 BCE. So their depiction of Brahmanical rites and ideas may well reflect a social context much different from the one in which Gautama himself lived. That need not mean that the new ideas must have belonged to a distinct culture. In this symposium, we will hear arguments that they did not. But even if they did, That culture need not have been limited to Magadha, greater or otherwise. In fact, they may have been widespread in South Asia outside the northwest. And it was just that the Brahmins picked up those ideas, or anyway felt the need to deal with them at that particular moment and under those particular circumstances as they moved into Greater Magadha. Bronkhorst defines Brahmanism as, quote, a homogeneous vision of Brahmins and their position in the world, unquote, formulated, and again I quote, during a difficult period in which their traditional position in the world was under threat, unquote. Bronkhorst's stated focus is the period of the Mauryas to the Guptas, which is indeed the formative period of Brahmanism. But the continuing success of the Brahmanical project derived from the ongoing application of similar forms of homogenizing self-definition and adaptation in subsequent eras. In any case, although the success of this vision relied on asserting its homogeneity, the challenge was not simply to deal with competing visions arising from Greater Magadha, but also to forge a sense of unity out of the internal diversity of the groups claiming the Brahmin label. This was an issue in the formative period, but persisted as an issue later as well. Bronkhorst also notes that the rise of Magadha seems to have coincided with the emergence of a new kind of Brahmin, the urban Brahmin, whereas Vedic culture is well known for being resolutely centered on the small settlement, the village or grama. Urbanization along trade routes produced bustling market hubs and courtly centers of royal rather than tribal power. The new religions appear to have sprouted and flourished in those environments and to have benefited from the new concentrations of wealth in them. But it's evident that some Brahmins in fact prospered in that new order as well. By the beginning of the Common Era, they began serving as court poets, as well as authoring treatises like the Arthashastra and the Kamashastra for royal and urbane audiences. How the Brahmins Won, which is the final book in the trilogy, ends with a brief chapter called Conclusions. How did the Brahmins win? After so many detailed discussions of relevant factors demonstrating what he sees as the distinction between these two separate cultures, it surprised me that the big reveal at the end turned out to be something rather simple: the persuasive power of stories. The two Sanskrit epics, the fables for the education of princes, all those stories of powerful forest sages meditating and performing Vedic sacrifices in ashramas were by themselves able to motivate kings to donate lands and lucre, and to employ Brahmin advisors and officials, and to patronize Brahmin arts and sciences. I don't think that's enough of an explanation. Stories were certainly part of Brahmanism's long-running public relations campaign, but only one part of it, and a secondary supporting part at that. Such a claim is, in fact, not so different from Sheldon Pollock's proposition that the intrinsic power of Sanskrit discourse was the engine that drove the Sanskrit cosmopolis. Bronkhorst correctly emphasizes that Brahmanism's success depended on the adaptability of Brahmins to adjust to the inexorable changes that came in the wake of urbanization and confrontation with the new powers and cultural forces, such as he emphasizes the Greek and Magadhan. They began by accommodating karma and rebirth into their cosmology, as in the Upanishads, and by offering their own version of long-term ascetical professions. Brahmanism succeeded through a combination of top-down imposition and role modeling, lateral influence, and bottom-up Sanskritizing by groups seeking to raise their status, but all that presumes that there must have been some concrete reasons why Brahmanical ideals and norms were considered persuasive or appealing in the first place. What was the special sauce that drew the power brokers, taste arbiters, and trendsetters? I contend that the recipe is to be found in the Griha Sutras and Dharma Sutras produced during and just after the Ganges urbanization. During this period, the Vedic priesthoods repositioned themselves to deal with the changing social, political, and religious environment. The confrontation with the Shramana sects had probably begun long before the Mauryas, as the eastward spread of Vedic culture met the expanding urbanization emanating from the east, which archaeologists indicate was beginning in the 6th century BC. Ashoka, or indeed other Mauryas, such as Chandragupta in the Jaina tradition, only exacerbated the problem by accelerating the shift of royal and private patronage. Bronkhorst supposes that the challenges and confrontations that the Brahmins faced included violent suppression, including slaughter. He looks to the Alexander romances to support his claim that Alexander killed a lot of Brahmins. As historical sources, these are fraught with difficulties. Then he suggests that Ashoka himself may have killed Brahmins, at least before his conversion to Dharma-mindedness. But I don't think there are grounds for thinking so. Ashoka laments the suffering he inflicted on Kalinga, but there's no hint that Brahmins were in any way singled out or specially affected. In fact, Ashoka himself says that Brahmins were unknown there, and by contrast, despite his personal attachment to the Buddhists, he consistently classes Brahmanas and Shramanas together as worthy of veneration and support. He does voice disapproval of killing animals, including in ritual, but he doesn't mention Brahmins in this connection. And he may not have had only Brahmin rituals in mind. Hari Falk may be right in thinking that popular festivities may have been the target of his criticism more than the rites prescribed in the Vedic canon. Perhaps the Brahmanas that he was dealing with were already something other than Vedic ritual-focused Brahmanas, in other words. Moreover, Ashoka enunciates an ecumenical conception of Dharma. That's the very opposite of sectarian partisanship. The crisis for Brahmins was probably more slow motion, not a bloodbath so much as a loss of market in religious service. A matter of competition in the marketplace of ideas and the need to gain and maintain stature professionally and socially. As wealth and political power shifted from the villages and concentrated in the cities that loom large in the scriptures of the Shramana religions and that figure prominently in narratives of the lives and activities of the Buddha Shakyamuni and Mahavira. The village-centered Brahmin priesthoods likely faced a shrinking clientele. It's likely that this began a couple of centuries before the Mauryas, if the archaeological dating of the Ganges urbanization is right. It was a gradual process depending on riverine trade and emanating from the east and predating the intrusive interference by Persians or Greeks. Bronkhorst says that the period of Brahmanism was not a mere, that the spread of Brahmanism was, quote, not a mere matter of religious conversion, unquote, because Brahmanism is a socio-political ideology with a variable religious dimension. Those are also his words. So kings did not convert to Brahmanism, he says. He is right in the sense that Brahmanism was not just a form of religion, but it developed into a socio-political ideology and a cultural system to which one could subscribe with its own distinctive markers of belonging for its adherents, the sacred thread, the symbolic and sacramental use of Sanskrit mantras, ritual styles, naming conventions, and so forth. And crucially, the employment of Brahmins in particular capacities. Kings could be converted to Brahmanism in the same sense that politicians can be converted to representative democracy, free market economics, or socialism. These are comprehensive models that need not compete directly with a particular religious affiliation, though they do have implications for what sorts or styles of religiosity are best. One can be devoutly Catholic socialist or a Muslim freethinker or a Hindu Democrat. And one can be a Buddhist Brahmanist like Ashwagosha, just as well as a Shaiva or Vaishnava one. That, in fact, is why using the term Brahmanism does not have to mean asserting that it comprises a single religion and that it should not imply that Brahmins themselves are wholly uniform in identity and beliefs. Both in modern times and earlier, there have been disagreements about who should count as a Brahmin, and there have been major status differentiations among them. In antiquity, those belonging to the three Vedas, Rig, Yajur, and Sama, which alone pertained to the Soma cult codified in the Shrauta Sutras, were distinct from those who recited the mantras and performed the rites of the Atharvans and Angiras, which dealt with the concerns of everyday life, ensuring wealth and health and defeating one's enemies. As Bronkhorst observes, one of the developments of Greater Magadha was the Atharvans' success in claiming at least equal status with other Brahmins and in getting their mantras in canon form and accepted as a fourth Veda. Bronkhorst is probably right that they were assisted in this by the fact that their expertise looked most useful to kings for appeasing malign cosmic powers, for consecrating kings properly and supplying them with supernatural weapons and armor. And on this, for these, this issue of the role of the Atharvans in this, and this expanding influence as regards serving kings, I would point to the work of Marco Geslani in the last few years. So Brahmanism, Bronkhorst defines Brahmanism as, quote, the culture carried by and embodied in Brahmins, a group of people who emphasize the purity of their descent from both the father's and the mother's side, descended from priestly religion with heavy emphasis on elaborate sacrifices. It further developed a socio-political ideology, claiming a separate status and higher rank than other human beings, ordained from creation, making them, as is often said in the maxim, gods among men. Bronkhorst calls this new the new Brahmanism, but it makes more sense to say that this is Brahmanism. This is the Brahmanism that took shape during the Ganges urbanization and the Mauryan era. The Vedic religion certainly provided scriptural proof texts and ritual models for what developed out of it. But Brahmanism is a larger phenomenon comprising a social ideology, a cultural idiom, and a style of religiosity that can be adopted and adapted for the worship of a variety of divinities. So what I'm going to try and do with my remaining time here is to try to adumbrate a more detailed explanation of the, a more detailed answer for the question how the Brahmins won. I can only give the barest outline here, which is why I've distributed the outline. Confronted by a new set of religious ideals carried by unworldly ascetics who nevertheless had captivated an influential audience, some section of the Brahmins decided to compete with the Shramana orders and the Dharma and the Dharmas, the models of the holy life that were taught by those orders, by developing one of their own. Brahmanical Dharma differed from the others by prescribing norms for the disciplined, consecrated householder, reconceived as a religious professional, analogous to the Shramana monks. And that this system of norms was a system of mildly ascetic regimens, consecrations, and purity rules to depict the observant married householder as a sort of in-the-world ascetic. Although the householder ascetic profession, which is, I think, a good way to gloss grihastha-ashrama, remained at the core of Brahmanical Dharma, Brahmanical models of celibate asceticism were also defined as well. In my early work, I've emphasized that our oldest sources our oldest source of information on ascetical practice in India are to be found in the Vedic Brahmanas and ritual codes. These are the precepts associated with practices called vrata or diksha, observances undertaken for fixed terms by those who undertake sacrificial offerings or in order to learn the Vedic mantras. There's no indication that such practices were ever undertaken on a permanent lifelong basis, at least at first. And they were certainly ascetical in character, nevertheless. Many of these practices show up in some form in the Shramana traditions, sometimes using similar terminology. If influence or borrowing between the traditions is suspected, whether of terminology or of the practices themselves, it is in any case likely that the borrowing was from the Veda to the Shramana groups, given that one of the most basic of these terms is the word for sexual chastity undertaken during Veda study, brahmacharya. It has this very specific meaning in the Brahmanical context, but it becomes the generic term for chastity, or sexual continence, across these traditions. The term is attested very early, and it's also clearly indexing Brahman, the signature concept of Brahmanism. So Brahmins had an ancient model for ascetic discipline, even if they were not in the habit of employing it on a permanent basis to escape the sorrows of this world. Next slide here. The Griha Sutras, Brahmanical codes of domestic ritual, began to be composed before the Dharma Sutras. Although they were devoted to household rites and practices, they are almost devoid of any reference to the grihastha status. As I say, that word is not used except in one or two appendices and late passages, or to the ideal of household life, that the idea that household life can constitute an ashrama. This concept appears only in the Dharma Sutras. But the Griha Sutras do introduce several innovations that do seem to reflect a concern with the status of Brahmins, and which seek to reframe the general social order around Brahmanical principles, with Brahmins as the yardstick of correct practice for others. In light of the social and political and economic changes of the Ganges urbanization, these innovations in ritual and doctrine look likely to have been put forward as a model for adapting to the new environment. The immediate consequence of the Griha Sutras, as the immediate audience, pardon me, of the Griha Sutras were Brahmins, to be sure, but they provide a manual for how to sell their services as domestic priests to a broader public, rather than the earlier focus on the Rajans, or big men of the tribal order. Those Griha Sutra innovations could provide the building blocks for full-blown Varnashrama Dharma that develops in the Dharma Sutras and in Manu. So the Griha Sutras add elements, they innovate by adding elements of high cult, that's what we call Shrauta ritualism, including Vedic mantras, to otherwise simple rites, such that the assistance of a Brahmin priest was needed or at least recommended. They make initiation into Veda study and the regimen of Brahmacharya, which had earlier been reserved or at least expected only of Brahmins, incumbent upon Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. In other words, to count as a Kshatriya or Vaishya, one should also go through that practice. We see this in the rules. Some of the texts give rules only for Brahmins, but then others of them begin to introduce differentiations in the rules for Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. Those variations then are in certain emblematic elements, such as the age of initiation, the season of initiation, the types of staff or garment, the mode of alms collecting, and so forth. And initiation itself is moved to the front of the list of life cycle rites, to replacing the wedding as the sacrament that marks the start of ritual competency and social status. It also, interestingly, these texts validate ceremonial practices of women and Shudras, at one point calling them supplements to the Atharva Veda. This is something I wrote about in 2013, 2015. Okay, so Patrick Olivelle has convincingly shown that the Apastamba Dharma Sutra was the oldest text to be composed explicitly for the purpose of presenting Brahmanical Dharma, using the word now in the way that the Ashoka and the Buddhists were doing, to denote a comprehensive religio-philosophical model, as opposed to a particular ritual rule or established practice, which is how the word tended to be used in the older Vedic works. There are good reasons to think that this text was composed in the Maurya period, perhaps in or perhaps near Greater Magadha, since both Ashoka and the Apastamba codes of domestic and Dharma, domestic ritual and Dharma, voice this concern with women's views on how to perform ceremonies, although they completely disagree about their value. It's in fact likely that the publication of Ashoka's edicts was the very impetus for Brahmins to begin composing Dharma Sutras. I should be showing you my, these slides. I'm not doing a very good job of keeping up with my slides. So this is where the first really datable attestation of the term grihasta is in these Ashokan edicts. And Patrick Olivell's edited volume 2019 called Grihasta is the place to look for the background on this. In any case, what are the innovations of the Dharma Sutras? The Dharma Sutras innovated by defining a rigorous form of household life as an ashrama, that is, as a mode of ascetic discipline. This new status was called grihasta, a word that is new to the Brahmanical literature, literally meaning one who stays at home in distinction from those who go forth, pravrajita, to become homeless mendicant shramanas. And the Dharma Sutras present this as the central ashrama of the Dharma, of Brahmanical Dharma. And indeed, Apastamba, the oldest of them, lays out the sort of the pros and cons of the non-domestic ashramas, leaning toward saying that they're all valid, even if the householder one is the most important. Gautama and Baudhayana Dharma Sutras reject the fourfold division. They take note of it, but actually reject the non-domestic ashramas. Vasishta accepts them all as the latest of them. This discipline of the household ascetic life consists of an expanding set of fixed term rules of discipline, called vrata generally, and purity rules. And Arya status, let's say, who counts as an Arya, is explicitly linked now to the Vedic initiation. The groundwork was already laid for that in the Grihya Sutras. It is here in the that the term dvija, twice born, comes into use, theoretically referring to the three higher varnas or classes, those other than Shudra. But although we see from its usage outside of these ideological texts, dvija still stuck in people's heads as basically referring as a synonym of Brahmin. Also in this context, the conferring of the sacred thread as a status marker is introduced in the latter two Dharma Sutras, as Bronkhorst himself points out, and Olivell and Bronkhorst point out. This is also where we see the region of the Aryas becoming a sort of rubric, initially sort of going no farther east than Greater Magadha, but then with Manu being expanded to the Eastern Ocean. Being an Arya means learning Veda, performing Vedic rites, and giving to Brahmins, right? I've got that in bold on the slide. This is a passage from Apastamba Dharma Sutra. So you can see them really reframing the social order around Brahmins, their rites, and their texts. Having put forward the idea of the married householder ascetic, Brahmin ritual authorities further sought to signal their status as religious professionals comparable to the celibate mendicants by promoting the ritualized feeding of Brahmins, especially those deemed especially pious, snataka, or learned, shrotriya, both statuses entailing the observance of strict vratas. So, I mean, in other words, it was recognized already. I mean, we see even in Ashoka's edicts, the notion of giving to Brahmanas and Shramanas as a general point, but we also know that in the Shramana traditions, there's a special emphasis on feeding the mendicants, right? Now, we begin to see an emphasis attempts to, well, basically this to put forward the notion that Brahmins ought to be fed as a matter of policy or as a matter of piety as well. Initially, this feeding appears only in limited contexts. They are the ideal, particularly learned or particularly observant Brahmins are the ideal recipients of the guest reception ceremony. And they are also gradually introduced, the idea is that introduced that offerings to the ancestors called Shraddha, that offering material should be fed to a Brahmin or to some Brahmins at the end of the rite. Here you see, again, that this is a practice which is carried on up to the present day in Hinduism. But we also see that the precept increasingly is generalized for the purpose of gaining blessings and success. Feeding Brahmins is something that one does in order to generate merit and win blessings, the blessings of the Brahmins. Just very similar to as one would do with the, say, Buddhist monks. Indeed, lest one wonder whether this sort of parallelism was really perceived, the Arthashastra actually includes a warning not to feed shakyas, as say Buddhist monks, or ajivikas at sacrifices or at shraddha rites, that's the ancestral rites. I mean, he would only say this, the text would only say this, if there was an assumption that people might not make fine distinctions in this regard. In other words, that the feed, by this point, by the point of the Arthashastra, the feeding of Brahmins and the feeding of Buddhist monks was seen as parallel sorts of endeavors. This systematic conflation of Brahmanhood as a sacred profession and Brahmanhood as a social status conferred by birth provided a rationale and a template for marking gradations of hierarchy and thus endowed Indian caste norms with a theological purpose and a social teleology. That is, it provided a basis for viewing those norms as part of a system. As I mentioned, the distinguishing marks of Kshatriya and Vaishya status were variations on those for Brahmins. Those markers defined the larger status category of Arya. Eventually, this model was expanded to accommodate even some sufficiently Sanskritized Shudras, those called Shudras anyway, a trend perceptible already in the late 6th century Shivadharma Shastra. Here's a passage from that. As ascetics in the world, Brahmin theorists further argued that their own expertise extended to social, political, and legal matters in a way that their rivals, the celibate monastic orders, could not match. Although the Sanskrit textual sources produced by the tradition itself are normative works that present an idealized picture of their place in the world, the vast inscriptional record provides another type of evidence that allows us to track the spread of Brahmanical institutions across time and space, and to assess the extent to which Brahmanical norms influenced social, political, and legal practices. More systematic analysis of epigraphical evidence, including comparative study of regional and period-specific patterns, is really needed to fill out this side of the answer. Bronkhorst says we know, quote, very little, unquote, about, quote, how Brahmins actually spread over South and Southeast Asia, unquote. This is in How the Brahmins Won. Our data are indeed limited, but much, much more information can be squeezed out of them. Epigraphy has long been studied almost exclusively for information, for just basically for lining up the names of and dates of kings and dynasties. That has been changing dramatically in the last 2 decades, and the new ERC Dharma project now underway will help set this question on a new footing. In any case, from early on, we can already see that Brahmin settlements were presented as disciplinary spaces analogous in many ways to monastic communities. Religious benefaction similar to what Ashoka offered reappears but with somewhat different and already formulaic phrasing in religious endowments of property, the so-called land grants that would become ubiquitous throughout South Asia and much of Southeast Asia over the next millennium and beyond. These were drafted on palm leaves, but then often recopied onto some sort of permanent support, such as stone or copper plates. The oldest surviving copper plate grants date from the 4th century CE, mostly from early Pallava and Shalankayana dynasties in the south. But even earlier examples of this type of record can be found inscribed in stone in the cave temples and monasteries made with ample patronage of the Satavahana kings, who styled themselves lords of the southern path. At first, these land grants continued to be composed in Middle Indic, as were Ashoka's, and recorded gifts mostly favoring non-Brahmanical religious groups, as say Buddhist monks and Jains. An early exception is the Nanegat inscription of Queen Nagnika, which is on the screen here, which begins with an invocation of Brahmanical deities and continues with an account of the performance of a huge range of Vedic sacrifices, complete with the lavish fees paid to the priests, gifts that included at least 2 villages and heaps of coins like those minted on the occasion of a Vedic horse sacrifice. This slide shows you a couple examples of that. The Satavahana kings during the first couple of centuries CE began producing more complex documents that stipulated privileges linked to the grant. The earliest examples recording donation of lands and villages to Buddhist monks are inscribed in stone in cave monasteries, but the format was probably already in wider use. In contrast with Ashoka's benefaction at Lumbini, which simply relieved the village of making tribute payments, the most notable innovation of the Satavahana inscriptions is the inclusion of a formulaic list of stipulated exemptions, pariharas, conferred with the gift. For example, the Nasik inscription of Gautami Putra, which is on the screen, records a gift of fields totaling 200 nivartanas to some Buddhist monks for their support. 6 years later, he gave a further 100 nivartanas of our royal land on the boundary of the city. The description of the property is followed by a list of 5 special privileges accorded to the recipient. In this record, each of the 5 exemptions is expressed in a single word, but in later records, the number and elaborateness of these privileges grows to become much more explicit. These 2 records speak of the legal immunity simply as ketasa parihara, exemption pertaining to a field. But other Satavahana inscriptions, including these exemptions on land donated to establishments of Buddhist monks, refer to them as bhikkhuhala parihara, exemptions pertaining to monks' farmland. The early century CE also saw increasingly more numerous indications of Brahmins receiving similar property endowments on very similar terms. The surviving Satavahana donations include the Mallavali pillar inscription, which is also on the screen here, which records an early Brahmin endowment, here called Bahmadeja, in favor of a Brahmin named Kondamana for the worship of a god Malapali. The grant includes, again, quote unquote, all exemptions, including no entry by officers. The earliest Pallava inscriptions, also in the south, employ the same exemption formulae, which the Maidavolu plates of circa 305 refer to as the exemptions of all Brahmadeyas. In other words, these are our earliest references to these things, but the documents themselves refer to these exemptions as if they are a well-known convention. So it seems, again, that the practice is older than the earliest evidence of it. The Maidavolu plate list stipulates that property is not to be dug for salt, not to be interfered with by district officials, not to be required to supply bullocks, and so forth, not to be entered by officers, Alberta Provision. It is in these Satavahana and early Pallava grants that we find the word bhatta used for the first time in an exemption clause. So this is again something that shows up across South Asia over time. The Mairavolu plates add penalties for those who might violate the terms of the grant. This later section this section later comes to include not only the immediate penalties that are threatened by the king, but also, and often exclusively, imprecations threatening repercussions in the next life on account of the sin incurred. In Indian land grants, this function is served by admonitory stanzas found already in the grant of Queen Charudevi of the 4th century, written in Prakrit, but now including a Sanskrit stanza at the end. Grants to Brahmins often indicated a range of objectives. The 4th century Piriha grant, also on the screen, I hope you can see it all. To me, it seems a bit cut off, states the intended purposes of the grant: to increase our merit, longevity, and strength, and desiring the peace and prosperity of the crown prince, but also to ensure blessings and to avert the curses of the resident Brahmins, who are both ascetically disciplined and learned. Such land grants proliferated in later centuries in Sanskrit, Tamil, Javanese, and other languages, and the lists and varieties of the exemptions and special privileges expanded drastically. The vast majority record donations to Brahmins, even though the earliest ones were to Buddhists and Jains. Donations to Brahmins either individually or by groups to establish endowed properties called agrahara or brahmadeya, or to support the worship of a temple normally managed by Brahmins. The increasing focus on Brahmin beneficiaries is not unconnected with Brahmins' prominent role in the offices associated with drafting and producing the very documents themselves, and with royal record keeping and administration. These endowed Brahmin estates helped propagate Brahmin authority in a diversifying range of religious contexts, and simultaneously produced a supply of literate, well-networked professionals claiming expertise as royal advisors, for example, Purohita, court officers, Dharmastha or Pradvivaka or Dharmadikaran, drafters of decrees and official documents, thus the Sandhi Vigrahaka, administrators, and so on. The distinctness of Brahmins' professional profile is reflected in the fact that even kingdoms that otherwise favored Buddhists or Jains in religious matters, even in such kingdoms, Brahmins and their policies were often still in demand, which belies any suggestion that Brahmins, qua Brahmins, faced hostility or violence necessarily from Buddhist or Jaina rulers. Okay, so to conclude, these are the steps, I think, by which Brahmin identity was defined and institutionalized during between the Mauryas and the Guptas. During that millennium, Brahmins succeeded in representing themselves effectively as a social birth status group that doubled as an order of religious professionals on a par with the celibate ascetics, with their homes and endowed enclaves taking the place of the monastery. Those among them who opted to become forest hermits, like the ones lionized in the epics, or wandering mendicants, were seen not as invalidating the more common garden variety Brahmins of the village. On the contrary, householder Brahmins were able to bask in the reflected glory of their virtuoso brethren, who were simply seen as living out a more intense version or the logical culmination of the same ideals. The Brahmins' specially high status in the social order had been presented in the Veda as part of the natural order, fixed at the dawn of the world, as putatively natural and divinely ordained as the division of beings into sexes. In the Griha Sutras, it was made the template for other Arya classes, and the veneration of Veda and Brahmins became the litmus test of belonging to the Arya social order. The Dharma Sutras completed the description of society by accomplishing the conflation of Brahmin caste and sacred order in adding the ashrama doctrine. The resulting Varna Ashrama Dharma, which achieved canonical form in the Dharma Shastra of Manu, which in effect became the constitution of caste, the systematic foundational expression of law that established it. This gave caste order a tenacity and a durability that transcended any particular kingdom or polity. Why was this law cited as authority in inscriptions? Even or especially foreign kings, those of foreign kings like the Shakas and Kshatrapas, as early as Rudradaman, circa 150 of the Common Era. This fusion of ascetic and domestic helped them sell themselves as having sacred knowledge that applied also to success in everyday life, a sort of prosperity gospel. It helped them to diversify into areas of secular, i.e. Laukika expertise, composing shastras and being consulted on an expanding catalog of subjects. Most importantly, it helped them make the pitch that they could provide crucial services in royal government, administration, and law. The Shramana religions made some efforts in that direction at various points, but in practice, they largely ceded the ground to the Brahmins, who cornered the market early on and maintained a near monopoly for expert knowledge on many secular topics. Early on, this success hinged on their ability to restrict access to their original cultural capital, the Vedic mantras, by resisting the use of writing in favor of laborious rote memorization, as Bronkhorst has noted, under the guidance of a Brahmin teacher, of course. But even with the adoption of written text production and transmission, the daunting complexities of shastric and courtly erudition helped Brahmins to maintain control of their intangible intellectual property and its licensing and distribution, so to speak. Elite institutions the world over operate similarly, but the systematic convergence of religious, cultural, and metapolitical rationales seems to have helped the Brahmins succeed to an extraordinary degree.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. Are there questions or suggestions, responses?
I had something oh, I'm sorry. Somebody has their hand up.
No, okay. Andrea, would you like to?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go after Andrea.
Sure, very good. Yes, thank you, Tim. I have a question for you, but also could be very well directed to Johannes and others. You made a remark, almost like a footnote, about the validation of the practices of Shudras and women, the supplemental practices in the Atharva Veda, which I think is a very central, very important observation. I mean, isn't this, that this merits further reflections? I mean, isn't this the way in which Brahmanism works, and this is why it won in the end, by incorporating, repackaging, appropriating this external marginal inferior. And I would say Greater Magadha plays a role in this. And this somehow, I think, reflects more a heterogenetic paradigm rather than orthogenetic, which you also mentioned, this problem of orthogenetic, etc. So could you maybe elaborate on that? I also ask you because I know you deal with Southeast Asian material. You have mentioned Pollock, etc. Does it bear also on the expansion of Brahmanism, you know, the adoption of Brahmanism in Southeast Asia? Was this a strategy by the Brahmins also to, you know, adopt very different existing practices that they didn't necessarily approve?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, one of the paradoxes of Brahmanism is that it has this, it has a reputation, a well-deserved reputation for having very strict rigid views on social hierarchy and social order. But the interesting thing is that, yeah, as you say, they also find ways to bring, what do you say, expand the umbrella, to bring in more people, precisely by allowing mechanism for them to gain status within that system, right? One of the things that I've noticed looking beyond sort of the heartland of Brahmanism, Southeast Asia, but also in Nepal and some other places, is that in these areas that might be called peripheries of North India, you know, the middle country of North India, you can see a sort of a more deliberate effort to try and represent society by the book, that's say by the Dharma Shastric model, to impose the four varnas in a much more mechanical and simple way than was ever possible in the heartland itself, where life was much more complex, where there were already a plethora of different social groups to be dealt with. I think that the model ended up being very appealing because it presented a status ideal that could then be adopted. But adopting that ideal, let's say getting recognition within that social model, meant acknowledging the religious authority, the priestly function, and so forth of Brahmins as the transmitters and carriers of those ideas. Does that, I'm not sure that quite gets at the question, but
maybe we can very quickly allow some of the other participants to make their contributions. I'm sorry, I didn't see the order in which yellow hands went up, but Lauren, would you like to quickly
I think Nathan was first, and then I'll go after him.
Oh, Nathan, right.
Thanks. So thank you, Tim, for that talk. That was really great. I'm a big fan of Tim's work in general, so I really appreciated that. But I just want to make a note actually about something. And I guess this was implicit in what you were saying, but I wanted to drive it home a little bit more. Like, I really like this idea of a Brahmanical project of painting the grihastha, the householder, as an ascetic type of lifestyle. And what I would add to that is, and again, I think this was probably implicit in what you said, but that the ashrama system seems to have been designed to do that specifically. I think sometimes maybe we get too fixated on particular word forms, and maybe we should focus a little bit more on verbal roots. So I think that the ashrama, the word ashrama used in the ashrama system, is responding in a sense to the word shramana, right? So what I see it doing is, because all four of the Dharma Sutra authors, to varying degrees, imply that the grihastha is the best or even the only valid ashrama, right? That's kind of an amazing statement, because basically what they're saying is like the best or the only real ascetic is the one who never leaves home at all. Which is clearly, to me, that is a comment against the general trend of discourse in India at the time, which is to say that there are these people who go forth and they're shramanas and so forth, right? So it seems to me that there's a very interesting ideological project going on there. Anyway, I'll just leave it there. I did have sort of a question for Tim, but I want to let others speak, so I'll let Lauren go now. Thank you, everyone.
We'll be back for general conversation after John's talk, so we can, if you can jot down the points, we can bring them up. Lauren, yes.
Thank you, Tim, for your paper. I have something to add and something to ask. So quickly, what I wanted to mention was about this idea of feeding Brahmins. I've encountered this in the context of the Agnihotra, and specifically in the earliest Agnihotra Brahmanas, which are the Kataka and the Maitrayani Samhitas. We have this idea that the Agnihotra is not to be performed by the Kshatriya, because, well, he's impure, he eats meat, and he doesn't observe religious obligations, he kills, etc. But should the Kshatriya offer food to the Brahmin, then the Brahmin is able to perform the Agnihotra for him on the new and full moon days, which is kind of an interesting idea. And the justification for this is that the Brahmin is identical with Agni. So offering in the Brahmin is the same as offering in Agni. So this has kind of earlier antecedents, and there may be more context in which this can be found, but I thought that was interesting. And my question for you, since you're presenting this work on kind of the Dharma material, your talk kind of spanned all of Bronkhorst's books, but in the context of Greater Magadha, how relevant would you say this Dharma material is given its dating, and in particular for the rise of Buddhism? So you mentioned Apastamba is the earliest text we have, and
Earliest
I know Olivel, yes, Olivel has a date for that. Do you agree with Olivel's date, and how do you contextualize it within this framework of the spread of these ideas we're discussing at the symposium?
Yeah, I'm guessing Olivel's date is more or less right. I think he says early 3rd century. I mean, I'm tempted to think that it could have been actually, let's say mid, because I'm tempted to think that it could be a response to Ashoka. But if this is one of these many, many matters of ancient Indian history that I don't think we will ever be able to pronounce on with absolute confidence. I mean, it's more a matter of circumstantial evidence. A preponderance of circumstantial evidence, in my mind, connects this Apastamba with Ashoka specifically. But it's possible that Ashoka is merely giving voice, right, to words, to ideas that were already floating around. He may not have been the genius here who came up with the concept of Dharma. I mean, normally it's been presumed that he's mimicking Buddhist discourse in talking about Dharma in this way. Although clearly his Dharma is not Buddhist Dharma limited. It's not limited to that. His conception of Dharma is rather ecumenical, right? So I don't know, but I would say 3rd century is a good guess.
Thank you.
I don't think it's earlier.
We are eating into Professor Peterson's time, but if we can make the next 2 remarks very, very brief. Johanna?
Yes, it is very, thank you for very briefly. Thank you for your paper. I liked it very much. It was very interesting for me, but I would like to give a little bit, maybe not general, but a remark from the Vedic point of view, because I was also always very much interested in why there is, from where this obsession of food comes, this problem, who is fed, who gives food, and so on. And in the Veda, especially in the Brahmanas, it is the scenario of eating gave the frames for conceptualization of world's functioning, but also the power relationships. So Kshatriya was the eater, and Vishya, or Vaishya, but rather Vish, they were food. In this context, Brahmins are not mentioned, but generally Brahmins are Agni, so they are always eater. But I think that the fact that the concept of eating was the basis for expression of relationship of power, it could also influence the later thinking, the later importance of this of the problem: who is fed and who is not, who can be fed, who should give food, and so on. So this is just a remark from the point of view.
I think that is a very apt observation. And actually, Patrick Olivel has an essay on eating and food that speaks to this sort of the symbolic value of food and eating in this in the early tradition as well. I think there's a slight difference there between the king saying the king eats everybody else is a sort of brute power. Whereas the notion that mendicants or Brahmins or anyone should be fed, I mean, again, there is a power relation being, so they deserve to be fed, but also in being fed, they are generating merit for the feeder and so forth. So it's a slightly different, it plays out in a slightly different way, but it may not actually be a completely different scale. It's just one is, the generosity of giving food, and the other is the capacity to consume others simply by virtue of brute power.
So they have spiritual power.
Yeah.
If they,
which
yes.
is still power, right?
Yes, I agree. I understand what you say. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Jason, did you want to? Can't hear you. You're muted.
Yes, sorry about that.
There we are, you're back.
Okay, yeah, so thank you for your patience. And thank you very much, Tim, for the talk, which I really appreciated in terms of bringing attention to the epigraphical sources as well as to the historical and material context. The question I wanted to ask was about the Aryavarta rubric, which you point out it actually emerges for the first time we can see it in the Dharma Sutra literature of Baudayana and Vasishta. How do we move from this conception of uncouth outsiders of Magadha and other Middle Kingdom type conceptions of what is the Brahminical heartland to a specific designation of places like these cultural regions, Aryavarta and Madhya Desha? And what kind of implications does this have then for positing a cultural region that is outside, such as Greater Magadha?
Well, I mean, clearly they were conceiving of this as a way of saying this is our world, right? This is the world where our values and our way of life and our rituals are performed, is where we are recognized. And so one of the points that Johannes likes to make is that, yeah, it's clear there were Brahmins and someone under the name Brahmin in Magadha at the time of Ashoka, because he refers to them, but that doesn't mean that it was a Brahminized part of the world. So that sort of a distinction is there. I mean, all right, so this is the thing, is that the history is one of it constantly expanding the boundaries of the civilized world, right? Or, well, shifting initially, right? Shifting from Gandhara down, or from the Punjab down the Ganges Valley. But then basically, initially it's just, between two rivers, or then it's between the disappearance of the Saraswati and Magadha. Then it's between the Western and the Eastern Oceans and the Himalaya and the Vindhyas to the north and south. And then finally, of course, Brahmins, I mean, basically, Brahmins kept coming, exceeding those boundaries. So insofar as they're there, I think that ended up expanding. I mean, they're not supposed to be going overseas either, but then you've got Brahmins in Indonesia, right? So I think it's just a matter of resetting the boundaries as needed, but still wanting to be able to say, these are the boundaries.
I guess my point is there seems to be a paradoxical contraction of the boundary of what is inside and what's outside, as there is an expansion of Brahminization.
Saying, because Madhya Desha then becomes, they continue to say, even in the South Indians say, the South Indian kings will be bragging, we brought in some Brahmins from Madhya Desha, they're the authentic ones, right? So
Johannes, sorry, Johannes wanted to intercede.
Yeah, about Aryavarta. I recently published a little note on academia, some of you may have seen it, trying to place Aryavarta a little bit more concretely in the political history. And I wonder if Aryavarta, to what extent it coincides with the Shunga Empire, because after all, we find it in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, who worked the first and perhaps subsequent Shunga rulers. And the amazing thing is, of course, that even though the Shungas apparently had power east of the confluence of the rivers, that is not included in Patanjali's Aryavarta. But what he describes about the Brahmins in that region suggests very strongly political supports. If the Brahmins do not need to worry about tomorrow and everything is in order and they don't save anything, I cannot imagine that in a political vacuum, but rather in a context of political support. And that's why I raised is that since Patanjali himself was a Shunga subject, does he here describe the part of and the Shungas, as we know, reintroduced Brahmanism after the Mauryas, who were not so fond of Brahmanism. And so a region that is so idyllic from a Brahmanical point of view as Aryavarta, well, might be there because of the political support from above, but it's all the more suggestive that the center of the old Maurya Empire, Magadha, is not included, which suggests that that was, in spite of Shunga rule, was not so fully Brahmanized. Well, just an idea.
Thank you. We must give space for Professor Peterson. So thank you very much. And we're in 3/4 of an hour, we can return to some of these questions and explore them further. We will add, it's now 10:45, so we need to add a little, something like 10 or 12 minutes to the end of Professor Peterson's time as well. So we're just shifting the schedule a little further forward. Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. John Peterson, who is the Chair of Linguistics and the Head of Department at Christian Albrechts Universität zu Kiel. Professor Peterson, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Sorry for some of the pictures. I just needed maps, and I hope it didn't hurt too much to see them from an Indological perspective, but I needed something. Yeah.
I was delighted to see the neighborhood join diagrams, because I'm using those in analyzing distribution of variant readings across manuscripts. So I'm into splits tree and all that stuff too.
I've been suggesting that to my colleagues here in other departments. So far, without your enthusiasm.
Well, I definitely feel that I'm stepping into somebody else's territory and I don't really know what all these things are. I'm doing my best. So thank you. Absolutely wonderful, fascinating material you're presenting us with. And let me open it up to conversation.
As I said in the beginning, well, people maybe are wondering if they're going to ask a question. The nice thing about this was when I finished, then I read Johannes's book, or actually just skimmed through it. And you probably will all know this feeling of elation when you find proof or something that backs what you've just written. And luckily I found it before it went to print. So
yes, Jason, did you want to start things off?
Yeah, I'll just start with a basic question, and I realize that you're presenting this from the perspective of modern linguistic typologies and so forth. But I'm wondering, in terms of historical linguistics, is this East-West divide that you've noticed with the NIA languages also how does that map on to the linguistic divide in MIA languages, particularly? With the Shokan inscriptions, we have an LR alternation. I'm wondering how that might kind of cohere with what you found, or is it possible to actually historically trace these divides back to the kind of periods that we're looking at? Because of course,
I have no idea.
Okay.
To be quite honest, I decided at one point, I used to be an Indologist until about 25 years ago, but 25 years is enough to forget basically everything you learned. So I decided at one point, I did my PhD on Pali, so I figured that would be no problem. But as an outsider trying to find your way through Middle Indo-Aryan, I mean, it's hopeless. I don't even know where to start. Yeah. And one of the problems is that that would be important from a perspective of someone working in traditional historical linguistics, because when you look at Ashokan inscriptions, basically you're not very interested in syntax. You're interested in the word forms for how the spread looked from a genealogical perspective. What I'm doing here is basically contact linguistics. And the problem is, in the literature, you will find everything from, yes, there is an LR difference, LNR switch in the East, and then you'll find another person saying, no, there's no such switch, and they will present some forms, and then you find someone who says everything became R, and then you find someone who says, no, everything became L. And it's very, let's just say you pick your data carefully when you say things like that, but as someone who now is thoroughly on the outside of this Indo-Aryan, of this Indological tradition, I need help, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. I would love to work with someone who's familiar with Indo-Aryan linguistics. I could read Pali again relatively quickly, but that is, of course, light years away from the Eastern Ashokan inscriptions. I don't know. I would welcome cooperation with anyone who's listening here. But I can't do this on my own, and you will not find the data you need in published sources, at least not in the form that you could just take them out of copy them out of a book and use them. You have to really get into the data. I've spoken with some people. When I discuss my data, they say, well, that's nothing new. We all know that Eastern Indo-Aryan is different. But the problem is you won't find that anywhere else. I mean, maybe people have noticed it, but I really checked in the beginning. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but I have never found it. When I ask for publications, they say, well, I don't know, but I remember reading something. So it's kind of, I think really it is something that's not new. No one's mind boggled by it, but I have never found it in print. Yeah, and what I like about this now is that the computer doesn't care what you want. It takes the data and gives you results based on a program that you're using. And the nice thing was that the computer agreed. So even if it's been done before, it's now, let's say the computer hasn't proven it, but it's shown that statistically there is something there, something very significant. But I welcome really from anyone here who's interested in Middle Indo-Aryan. This would be fascinating. But these are definitely contact phenomena.
Andrea.
Yes, thank you, John. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Our profiles are very much complementary. I know a little bit about religion, but I know almost nothing about this linguistics, Indo-Austroasiatic linguistics, etc. But I think your hypothesis is very important for Greater Magadha. So I think is basically your basic assumption is that there is some kind of overlap between the linguistic substratum and the cultural substratum of
I'll leave that up to you.
Well, okay. Yeah. Well, I don't think I'm the right person, but I wanted just if you could elaborate more on that. And that I have another question or remark. You seem to have kind of referred to some sort of marginalization process when you say that Indo-Aryan speakers were not really interested in occupying those inhospitable, areas that were not really good for agriculture. And this kind of, makes me think about similar process, if I have understood correctly, similar process going on in Southeast Asia, for example, in mainland Southeast Asia, in the Malay Peninsula, where Austronesian dominant language has basically superseded the substratum of Austroasiatic speakers that are now confined to mountains and very inaccessible areas. Also, there is some kind of asymmetrical relationship in the contact between those populations, which kind of seems to replicate that pattern.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, with respect to your first question, it would seem a miracle if there were no cultural interaction. Especially, and maybe Magish can tell us more about this in his talk. There is, by the way, David Reich also. Let me use one of his pictures in the article that's about to appear with the primary author of Jessica Ivani, where you find DNA typical of Austroasiatic speakers all the way up into the Ganges, what do you call it in English? The Ganges Delta, the Ganges Basin, Indo-Gangetic Basin, whatever. But if it were, for example, predominantly men going into this region, for example, as traders or adventurers or whatever they were, they would have taken local wives then, most likely, and their children would have been raised, of course, to a very large extent, influenced by their mothers with the local traditions. So it would be a miracle, I think, from my perspective, to assume that the indigenous population did not have a massive effect on the culture. I cannot say anything more about that. I'm a linguist. Give me linguistic data and I will give you my views on what that tells me. But connecting a language to a culture is an extremely dangerous thing. So I would be very hesitant to go much farther than to say I would be immensely surprised if there were no influence from the local ethnic groups. There must have been massive, yeah. What we know is that the language of the newcomers, and that's a fact, I mean, the languages are still there and they're massive, they're huge languages, 20, 30 million people speak them. And if you go to the Delta, of course, Bangla has 150 million speakers. So their languages won out, but the indigenous groups left a huge imprint on these languages. So I'm sure the culture would have been affected. Of course, the problem you would have is that everything is in the Indo-Aryan languages and from a very high caste, if I can use that term, perspective, but there must have been influence. I can't think of how there could not have been. And with respect to Southeast Asia, Nicholas Evans, Enfield, sorry, at the University of Sydney is a specialist on these languages in Southeast Asia, Language Contact, and he's written a new book of his has just appeared in the Cambridge series, the Green series, as we call it. Like the book, The Indo-Aryan Languages by Colin Wasika, he's now published one on Southeast Asia. And that's not his first book. And he also has some very good articles on contact in mainland Southeast Asia. So I'll be happy to send you those references. But there's quite a bit of work. And again, it's the higher you go, the more density you have linguistically. That's where these languages survive. Yeah.
Johannes.
Yes, John, I have one question. You base your conclusions on data which are languages spoken today, yeah, and you draw conclusions about a past. Can you say anything about the chronological side? Which past? When did all this happen or begin? Is it, for our purpose, central? Is it important to know? Is it relevant to the period of when Buddhism started?
You got me there. I'll do my best. Okay, if I go back to, oops, hold on a second. Okay. Oh, that was, okay. I'll give it a second try. Yeah. All I can say is if you look at, it's there. If you look at this map, these are the languages of India as they're spoken now. All I can say is, of course, we have no written records of any Munda language prior to the 19th century, and these come from missionaries who, for their own purposes, wrote down these languages. They wanted to translate, they wanted to convert. But what we see, the yellowish ones, the greenish yellow ones, they're Munda languages, and they are where we expect a language to survive the onslaught of a new language coming into the region. We expect it to get lost where it's low and flat and good for agriculture, and only to survive in regions which no one else wants, to put it bluntly. All I can say is, time and again, from a linguistics perspective, we see this situation where these remnant languages must have once been spoken more widely. Yeah? If there were no other people here, certainly some of these speakers of these other languages would have moved eventually into the delta, into I keep saying delta, sorry, into the basin, the Ganges basin, and started farming. They farmed here, so why not farm where they can do it better? Yeah. So what we expect from a linguistic point of view is they must have been there. All we can use are the present languages and what we know of them, and try to go backwards chronologically as carefully as possible, using what are the default scenarios. Yeah? There is a theory that says the Munda speakers moved from hill to hill. They have mountain gods. Yeah. I don't see that at all. I don't see that at all as a convincing argument. They're at the hills now because the good lands are gone. I can't imagine an entire ethnic group populating a continent by moving from mountain to mountain. What else could it have been? I think the question here is, what else could it have been? Yeah, I have some, I mean, there must have been other peoples here as well. I'll show you a different, from an article of mine together with Netra Paudial. He's actually the first author. Here it is. This is a language called Kurmali. Can you see it? No, okay, one second. Okay, here. These are some words in this language. This is spoken in Eastern Jharkhand, and this is an Indo-Aryan language, but they say of themselves, we are a tribe. We've lost our language. And if you look closely at it, you can see there are many words here. Some of them may eventually turn out to be Indo-Aryan, whatever. They don't seem to be Dravidian. They're certainly not Munda, and they don't look Indo-Aryan either. For example, Tanau, to see. Tomcake, to wait. Ache is a typical infinitive marker here. Sarg, to sleep. Nora, to eat. This suggests that there may have been isolates here as well too, and an isolate is nothing else, of course, but the remnant of an earlier family. Yeah. So we have some evidence for other language families in the region as well. All I can say with any definiteness is that we have Munda languages and Dravidian languages and traces of other families. So why wouldn't there have been at an earlier time a wider spread of these languages when Indo-Aryan moved in? Because Indo-Aryan does what a newcomer language does with power. It replaces the other languages. If you look at North America, everyone speaks English now, but when the Europeans first arrived, there were several hundred languages in what are now the United States. Yeah? So this is a very typical scenario. And with respect to the time, sometime after the Indo-Aryan speakers arrived. It will have been relatively quick in the plains. It will have been very late in the mountain regions. And this, I observe it going on now in Chota Nagpur, in the mountain, in the plateau, the Ranchi Plateau. It's taking place now. And that's what we expect. It takes place very much later. It's only in recent times, actually, that accretion zones are still being conquered by the newcomer languages because of radio, television, internet, schooling system, etc. I would assume that given their predominance in terms of trade, weaponry, perhaps, and many other reasons, that speakers saw it as advantageous to switch to Indo-Aryan relatively early. It may have been 100 years, it may have been 400 years, but it certainly will not have been 1,000. No? I can't get any more exact than that, sorry. Actually, I was hoping you would tell me.
Thank you. Patricia, if you're there, this would be maybe a moment to bring in some of the questions from people who've been posting them on Slido. Patricia is a research fellow here at the University of Alberta, and I had asked her to keep an eye on Slido. But I also know that she, yes, hi Patricia.
If I can say one thing for anyone who's, I have the bibliographic information as well. Anyone who would like a copy of the handout, I wasn't sure where to put it. And I couldn't, normally I would just put it on the chat, So if you just send me a mail, I'll be happy, or a chat here, in the chat here, a message, I'll be happy to send it to you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
feel free to drop it in the chat. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah. Okay.
And just to let everyone know, I've been moving a few of the questions from the Q&A in Zoom over to Slido. And if you want to take a look at that site, you can upvote other people's questions. So if someone asks a brilliant question that you want answered, you can bump it up the list. But I'll start with the first question we have here. It's from Eli Franco. This is to Dr. Bronkhorst. I did not understand how Samkhya philosophy supports your theory, especially if one follows the idea that the plurality of Purushas was a later development.
I would say that the detail of how many Purushas are considered is relatively irrelevant. The fundamental ideas that I proposed in my book is of the presence in human beings of a self that is completely inactive, and that the discovery of the inactive nature of the self is a major step towards liberation. And that, of course, is quite central to Sankhya in, I would say, all of its forms. So, of course, Sankhya, the philosophy, went through various developments over time, and there were different schools and different opinions here and there. But this seems to me so central and so much linked to what I consider the central ideas of the culture, of the religious culture of Greater Magadha, that this link seemed to me rather obvious.
Great. So move on. The next question, again, for Dr. Bronkhorst. You state in this lecture that Brahmins were newcomers, and yet Buddhist texts suggest that King of Koshala, Prasenjit, held a large Shrauta sacrifice. So perhaps you could speak a little bit on that.
Well, there's all that much I can say, but so there were presumably Buddhists in the area and Brahmins in the area where the Buddha preached. And Brahmins would, as I understand their procedure, would try to get access to the royal courts. This is one of their favorite ways of getting influence in different parts of the world. And of course, once they have a foothold at the court, they may propose, sometimes with success, to perform sacrifices. So the performance of such a sacrifice is in itself no proof that they have been there for very long. And I talk not about 10 years, but perhaps about a few generations, relatively short period compared to the earlier Vedic period as it was towards the West, in Kuru Panchala, for example. Yeah.
So the next question is for Dr. Peterson. This is from, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name, Diego Lucota. How do ancient attestations of the Eastern Indo-Aryan languages, example, the Ashokan corpus, fit into your model?
Yeah, I believe that was Jason's question as well. I can only repeat what I said then. I can't answer the question. The Ashokan inscriptions, whatever language they may represent, were a language chosen at that time. It may have been the language of the land, it may have been something else, but I have not gone through them in detail. And actually, I would have to first really learn these variants of Middle Indo-Aryan, which I've never worked with. So as I said then, I will be happy to work with anyone who knows these languages and can cooperate with me. That is one of my goals eventually, is to find how the languages changed from then till now. I mean, in general, we know that, but we can't really say in detail whether this, and I think this you always have this question, especially with the Middle Indo-Aryan languages, where you find the text is not necessarily where the language is spoken. So it will always be fraught with dangers. Part of me wants to shy away from that, but I think with help, it could be fun. Yeah.
I have another question for you. Your data suggests to me a major influence on the Western Indo-Aryan languages that differentiated them from Eastern languages and everything else. Thoughts?
I would disagree. I went through this phase myself, and I respect it, but I've come to reject it for a number of reasons. Perhaps, I mean, I'd have to know what this person is thinking of. If it's structural criteria, then the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is something like ergativity, which I suggest, and I do that in an article, the data I was using from simplicity and complexity, that's being reviewed right now for publication. I suggest there that ergativity or the PPP construction is actually a type of simplification. This is something that language learners can use to replace all those different conjugations and irregular forms of the imperfect, the perfect, and the aorist. You just have one new construction, you learn the PPP, and you're done. So I would say this was a learner strategy affecting Old Indo-Aryan, which was massively complex. I mean, anyone who's even looked at a page of Vedic knows that. Classical Sanskrit is a walk in the, walk in the rose garden compared to that. But for learners, this would have been a simplification. And it stretched all the way into the East, but in the East it was lost. I mean, Maithili used to have ergativity, and we find it in many more languages where we know nowadays it's gone. That doesn't mean it was found everywhere in the East, but it was quite widespread in the East, and it has generally been lost where it once was. We still have a few islands. So I would say the changes took place in the East. Yeah? There definitely were changes in the West, but they affected then all of Indo-Aryan, I believe. This, of course, depends on the discussion that Dominik was having with Johannes. Did we have two waves or one? I've just assumed one, and that some moved into the East, and that's what changed. The two-wave model fits here wonderfully as well. It's still take your pick here at the moment. But I'd love to know what that person was thinking of when he or she wrote it.
Well, Andrew O, so maybe he'll contact
Andrew,
you at
please
some
write
point.
to me.
Sven Wortman asks Professor Bronkhorst, labels like high, moderate, low degree of Brahminization have to be distinguishable in order to mean something. How can we measure them?
Did I actually use these terms? I'm not quite sure. Would I use them? I would make a rather strong division between, in classical Brahmanism or the new Brahmanism, you name it, there is a vital difference if the Brahmins have access to the centers of power, to the royal court. And in that case, one can speak of the region concerned as being Brahmanized because to some extent it's imposed from above. The mere presence of Brahmins, and perhaps that's the point I wish to emphasize, does not make a country Brahmanical. I think there are lots of Brahmins in North America and the United States, but no one would call it a Brahmanical country because the ideas linked to Brahmanism are not imposed in any way. They have no influence on daily life of the country as a whole. I think there that is an important factor to distinguish between degrees of Brahmanization. A country in which the rulers, they're not perhaps converted, but they support and to some extent impose Brahmanical rules, that is a Brahmanized country. Whereas everywhere else, Brahmins constitute just one group among others. And as we see, it's quite interesting. In the Buddhist texts, there are all these discussions between invented or true, I don't know, historical or not, that's not the issue, between the Buddha and Brahmins. And the topic of discussion is almost always exactly the same. The Brahmins want to say, to prove, to convince that they are superior to everyone else. I suppose that was a major concern of Brahmanism when spreading. As long as no one really cared about their claims, as in the Buddhist texts, the Buddha shows that basically there's nothing special about them, the country is not Brahmanized. But by the time that they have succeeded to at least some extent, have succeeded in convincing a country and especially its rulers of their superiority, then the situation is completely different.
I have another question from Adish Satye. He says, I may have missed it, but is there any East-West regional variation that you notice amidst this Sutra period formation of Vedic Brahmin social identity, which is, as I see it, at the essence of the Greater Magadha thesis?
If the question is for me, I wouldn't be able to respond. Perhaps Tim will have something to say about that, but the problem with many of the Brahmanical texts, of course, is that they're very hard to localize geographically, except in some particular cases, like the Kanva version of the Shatabhata Brahmana and some other cases. And of course, the Buddhist and the Jain texts, they can be at least basically localized in the East. Many of the Vedic texts about the Grihya and Shrauta Sutras, I would ask Tim. He may have an answer to that. Do you, Tim?
You'll have to unmute yourself, Tim.
Yeah, the problem of localizing them is extremely grave. And actually, I think the problem is even worse in some ways for the Grihya Sutras. So I don't think in these few moments we can, I can elucidate that much.
We've got a two-part question here for Professor Peterson. It says, as a linguist, this is from Sridhar, I found your hypothesis about the East-West divide intriguing. The first question is, how do the clustering of languages in the neighbor net analysis compare with the traditional convergence theory in explanatory power? And then secondly, in some areas, Kannada seems to pattern with Nepali.
Yeah, you do find strange things when you put the data into the computer. It all depends, basically. I mean, there's that old saying, garbage in, garbage out. If I've asked the wrong question, the computer will give me the right answer to it anyway. So I may have, it is possible, for example, that with respect to gender, you may have a similar system in Canada as you have in Nepali, as well as the lack of whatever, a consistent plural formation. It's things like that. So it is possible to have completely unrelated languages which are far apart clustering together structurally. The fact that so little of that is found suggests that it is a fluke. I mean, if the way the data was put into the system produces that. It may be a mistake in one or two of the data, but it also may just be that the computer, the program, sees these two as similar because with respect to these criteria, they are. Yeah. So I don't have an explanation for that. That's probably just a fluke of the data. And we do have some of the languages like Nepali being more in the east and more in the west and things like that. So we also have central Dravidian languages grouping with Western languages, although we would expect them to group with the Eastern languages. So these things happen. With respect to the genealogical, I think that's what was meant, genealogical groupings of Indo-Aryan. We find, if I can, yeah, I can still share here. So I'll share that. And can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'll move up to the. If we start with the geographically based system, we basically find what we find here: the Eastern languages, Magadha, and Oriya, and Bangla, and well, Assamese is a little bit different from the Tibeto-Burman influence, of course. We basically find Eastern Indo-Aryan behaving as a group and being similar to Munda. But that just begs the question of how this traditional, in scare quotes, this traditional genealogical representation was arrived at. Is this just basically, okay, I give up, we'll just use this system? And it makes sense to a large extent. We do have Magadhan languages showing very pronounced common developments with respect to phonology. Yeah, so it makes sense that the Eastern languages would structurally be similar because they have the same neighbors, but also have the same phonological developments because they arrived pretty much at the same time. So very often they do converge. This, of course, is a whole different matter. I haven't said it so far, but I will now. I completely disagree with the inner-outer hypothesis. I mean, we may find some things between Southern and Eastern Indo-Aryan which are similar, like the L for the past tense. Yeah, I don't think that is related to an internal family development, which is specific to these. It was probably lost someplace else. It may be due to tribal influence, which I doubt. So if we look at this traditional analysis, it doesn't fit at all. But if we look at the geographical analysis, the largely geographically motivated classification, we find a lot of convergences. I hope that answers the question.
I do too. I've got a question from Patrick Olivel for Johannes. So I would like to hear your view about why the entire Ashokan inscriptional corpus, the main elements of the Magadhan culture you have identified, are missing.
Missing from my book, I suppose. If that's what, they are of course not missing historically, but why have I not discussed them? Because I was not quite sure what it would add or otherwise to my thesis, to my theory, as important as they are for many other respects. But of course, if Patrick can tell me that actually their study could improve or weaken or somehow my theory, I would be delighted.
Sorry, I can't, I'm poking about now. I can't find Patrick's question, but when I first read it, what I thought he was saying was, why are karma and rebirth not mentioned in the Ashokan inscriptions? That's what I took away from it, but I can't quite see it anymore. But I think that was his question.
I've popped the entire question down in the chat, just if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that. I don't know if it is problematic, but it is something for which I don't have an easy answer. After all, as has been observed several times, Ashoka recognizes the existence of Brahmins and Shrammanas. And presumably he is or was aware to some extent of the ideologies or beliefs underlying these different groups. And so in that respect, there was no need for him to mention rebirth. On the other hand, by becoming a Buddhist himself, it is hard to believe that he became a Buddhist without accepting rebirth and karmic retribution. So it may not have been mentioned explicitly, but I suppose that his association with Buddhism implicitly implies that this worldview was known to him and that he even accepted it.
Okay, and another question for you about coinage. So this is from Edward Ross. The idea of coinage playing a role in karmic retribution is interesting. Could this have had any connection to how Buddhist ascetics were not allowed to handle monetary objects?
Well, I'm a bit embarrassed that I raised this whole issue of money at all, because it was just, as I said, I have not really thought through all this, but I thought it might be, since we are now talking about Greater Magadha, I thought it might be a piece to be followed in future. But I'm far from being able to say anything specific on what precise facts it had and why it should work like that. So, sorry, so I won't answer that because it is not yet in my field of competence, so to say.
Fair enough.
Shall we have one last question, Patricia?
I was just about to ask how we were doing for time. Let's see.
Can we maybe have the upland lowland lifeways question from Julia Shaw?
Yes, certainly. So Julia Shaw, polarizations between upland and lowland lifeways is challenged by archaeology in South and Southeast Asia for impact of non-timber forest productions on urban economies. I'm not sure exactly who this question is directed to. Does your research include comparative analysis of crop-based agriculture terms versus forest-oriented animals and vegetation?
I think that's for John.
Yeah, I agree.
I was afraid that you were going to say that. I have no idea. I am not at all an archaeologist. I was fascinated to find for the first time in my life in Johannes's book mention of different kinds of pottery, and that the boundaries seem to correspond somewhat to what I had found. I know nothing more than that. Anything else I say is just a repetition of that. I don't know.
Well, I think probably it's time to draw things to an end. It must be getting a bit late in the Eastern European area. Thank you all very much. What a great collection of ideas and conversations. Thank you very much for today's materials. And I look and thank you also to all of those who've participated from outside the seminar and who have also given us very good and thoughtful questions. Thank you, everybody, and see you at the same spot on the dial tomorrow morning for me, tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.